The coldest fact about Atlantis is that no confirmed ruin has ever risen from the sea to prove it was real. Yet the story survived for more than 2,000 years, not as a map, but as a warning about power, memory, and the fragile edge between civilization and loss. Perhaps the deepest mystery is not where Atlantis sank, but why humans kept needing to imagine it. So what is the real story of Atlantis, and where did the legend come from? Atlantis does not first appear as a ruin underwater, or as a broken wall lifted from the seabed, or as a name carved into stone by the people who supposedly lived there. It begins in writing. More precisely, it begins in the works of Plato, the Greek philosopher who lived in the 4th century before the Common Era, in 2 dialogues now known as Timaeus and Critias. That simple starting point matters because it changes the way the whole story must be heard. The earliest source we have is not a sailor's log, not a temple record from Atlantis itself, not an excavation report, and not a list of kings from a lost island. It is a philosophical text, built around conversation, argument, memory, and moral comparison. Before Atlantis was a place people tried to find, it was a story placed inside a carefully shaped discussion about cities, power, order, and decline. This does not make the story meaningless. It only asks us to hold it with the right kind of care. Human beings have always carried the past in fragile containers: bone, stone, song, names, and finally writing. Long before cities, our ancestors learned to remember what mattered by tying memory to landscape, danger, food, water, and loss. A flooded valley, a vanished camp, a shoreline that changed across generations could become more than an event. It could become a warning. Atlantis belongs to a later world of scrolls, schools, and political debate, but it touches that older human habit, the need to turn disappearance into meaning. In Plato's account, Atlantis is not introduced as a neutral description of a distant land. It is framed through speakers who recount an old tale, said to have passed through Egyptian priests, through Solon, and through Greek family memory. Whether that chain preserves any older echo is a question that must remain careful and open. What can be said with confidence is narrower but stronger. The story reaches us through Plato's literary and philosophical design. That is where the evidence begins. This is why responsible history starts not by pointing to the ocean, but by returning to the page. The page tells us what kind of object Atlantis first was. It had geography, yes, with rings of land and sea, with wealth, ships, metals, and a great power beyond the familiar Greek world. But those details appear inside a larger contrast. Atlantis is shown as mighty, ambitious, expanding, and eventually defeated. Its greatness is not offered only to inspire wonder. It is used to examine what can happen when abundance and power move beyond restraint. A city can look strong from far away while becoming unstable from within. That is a human pattern older than Plato, older than empires, older even than settled towns. From the first small groups who depended on shared memory and trust, survival was never only a matter of strength. It also depended on limits, cooperation, and the ability to read danger before it became irreversible. The first mistake in approaching Atlantis is to treat the absence of a confirmed ruin as if it destroys the value of the legend. The second mistake is to treat the beauty of the legend as if it proves the ruin must exist. Between those two errors lies a quieter path. Atlantis can be studied as a real cultural event even if it has not been confirmed as a real city. It entered human memory through a known author in a known intellectual world at a time when Greek thinkers were asking what makes a society just, what makes it corrupt, and why even powerful communities can fall. The real beginning of Atlantis is therefore not a submerged gate or a hidden harbour. It is a written voice asking later generations to imagine a civilization at the edge of loss and to ask why such images continue to feel so near. A story does not need a confirmed city beneath the waves to become powerful. It needs a shape that fits an older human fear. Atlantis has that shape. It is a place described as rich, ordered, confident, and almost too complete, and then it is gone. The mind notices that pattern immediately, because human memory is not built only to store facts. It is also built to notice danger, loss, change, and the warning signs that come before collapse. Plato's tale entered the world as philosophy, but it moved through later centuries with the force of memory because it felt like something human communities already understood. A settlement can be safe for many generations and then fail. A coast can feed people and then flood. A political order can look permanent and then fracture. The details of Atlantis belong to an ancient Greek text, but the emotional structure is far older than Greece. In the deep beginning of human life, before writing and before formal history, people survived by remembering what had happened in places. A water source that dried out, a path that became dangerous, a shore that changed after storms, or a camp that could no longer hold a group, all of these would matter not as abstract ideas, but as lived knowledge. Memory was connected to bodies moving through real ground. It was connected to hunger, shelter, kinship, and the need to pass warnings forward. That is one reason Atlantis could travel so far beyond Plato's pages. It speaks in the language of place lost to time. It gives a form to the uneasy knowledge that human achievements can disappear, even when they once seemed strong. Yet this power can be misleading if it is treated carelessly. A story that feels true is not automatically a record of an event. Human beings often feel truth through pattern before evidence arrives. A tale may preserve a moral insight, a political criticism, a fear of the sea, or a memory of disasters heard from many directions without preserving a single recoverable city. The responsible question is not only whether Atlantis existed exactly as described, it is also why the description continued to feel believable. Plato placed the tale in a setting where old knowledge was being reported across cultures and generations. That framing makes Atlantis sound ancient even inside the ancient world itself. It gives the story distance. It also gives it authority, because the listener is asked to imagine that the Greeks are hearing something older than their own memory. Such a device is powerful. It turns a philosophical example into something that feels like inherited testimony. Later readers could then lean toward the sea, toward maps, toward ruins, toward the hope that the story was not merely an argument but a doorway. Atlantis survived because it lived at the crossing of two human needs. One need is for evidence, the careful wish to know what really happened. The other is for meaning, the quiet need to understand why loss happens at all. Civilizations leave stones, tools, roads, graves, and broken pottery, but they also leave questions inside later minds. A vanished world can become a mirror. People looking at Atlantis are often also looking at their own societies, their own coastlines, their own fear that wealth and order are never permanent. In that sense, the legend works like a deep memory even when it is read as literature. It gathers the old human awareness that shelter is temporary, that water changes boundaries, that power can outgrow wisdom, and that the past is always partly missing. It leaves a quiet silence where certainty itself might have stood. The story feels historical because it rests on real human experiences, even where its city remains unconfirmed. That is why Atlantis did not stay locked inside a dialogue. It became a lasting image of civilization remembered at the moment it disappears. Atlantis asks a question that is larger than the island itself. What happens when a society becomes powerful enough to forget the limits that once protected it? In Plato's telling, the lost kingdom is not only wealthy, it is organized, skilled, ambitious, and able to project force beyond its own shores. That is why the story does not feel like a simple fantasy of treasure under the sea. It feels like a warning built around a human pattern. Communities grow by learning how to store food, defend land, move goods, share rules, and pass knowledge forward. Yet the same growth can create distance from the conditions that made survival possible in the first place. Long before palaces and harbours, early human groups lived close to consequence. A poor decision about water, shelter, trust, or migration could be felt quickly in the body. Hunger, cold, illness, and conflict were not symbols. They were immediate facts. The beginning of human society was therefore tied to attention to landscape, to season, to other people, and to danger. Atlantis matters because it imagines what happens when that attention is replaced by expansion, pride, and the belief that strength can stand outside nature. This is why the moral shape of the legend is so important. Plato does not present power as evil by itself. Human beings need cooperation, planning, tools, and shared order to live. Every lasting community depends on some form of power, because someone must build, remember, judge, protect, and teach. The danger appears when power stops serving balance and begins serving only its own increase. Atlantis becomes a picture of abundance without enough restraint. Its wealth makes it impressive but also heavy. Its ships and armies make it reach farther, but also expose the distance between movement and wisdom. Its order gives it shape, but order can become brittle when it is no longer guided by humility. In this way, the legend touches a problem found throughout world history without needing to be treated as a confirmed historical report. Cities have fallen for many reasons: environmental stress, war, internal tension, shifting trade, disease, leadership failure, or several pressures at once. Responsible history does not reduce collapse to one dramatic cause when the evidence is complex. Atlantis, as a story, compresses that complexity into a single image, a great society brought to the edge by its own direction. The listener is not being asked to accept a hidden ruin as fact. The listener is being asked to sit with the uneasier idea that civilization is never separate from the human body that builds it. Every wall begins with hands. Every law depends on memory. Every harbour depends on water behaving within a range people can endure. Every generation receives a world it did not make, and changes it before passing it on. From the first small bands of humans to the later cities of the ancient Mediterranean, the same quiet truth remains. Survival is not guaranteed by intelligence alone. A clever species can still misread its own success. That may be the deepest reason Atlantis became so durable. It gives a shape to the fear that achievement can become a kind of sleep. People can live inside systems so large and familiar that they no longer feel fragile. They may look at roads, ships, markets, temples, records and armies, and mistake complexity for permanence. Atlantis pulls against that illusion. It reminds the mind that the line between order and loss is not always visible while people are crossing it. Its value is not in proving that one island once sank exactly as described. Its value begins earlier and more quietly, in the way a philosophical tale turns human pride into geography, turns political fear into an oceanic image, and leaves civilization standing beside the sea, listening for the sound of its own limits. Plato wrote the Atlantis story in a world that had already learned how quickly confidence can turn into ruin. Athens was not a calm city looking back from a safe distance. It had lived through war, plague, political violence, defeat, and deep arguments about what kind of life a city should choose. The Peloponnesian War had damaged the old belief that Athens could remain strong simply because it was brilliant, wealthy, naval, and culturally alive. The city had seen its democratic order shaken, its empire broken, and its public life filled with distrust. Plato grew up close to that wound. He was not writing about power as someone who had only imagined it from books. He had seen a famous city become uncertain about itself. In that atmosphere, a tale about a mighty island kingdom rising, expanding, and then vanishing would not have sounded like a distant curiosity. It would have touched a fear already present in Greek civic memory, that a society can mistake success for wisdom. This matters for the real story of Atlantis, because the legend first appears inside a mind deeply concerned with political failure. Plato's Athens had inherited older glory, but it also carried the memory of choices that led to suffering. A navy could protect trade, yet also tempt a city toward domination. Wealth could support temples, drama, debate and learning, yet also feed rivalry and pride. Public speech could guide a community, yet also confuse it when persuasion became stronger than truth. These were not abstract puzzles for Plato. They belonged to the streets, courts, assemblies, and wars of the city around him. Long before Athens, the first human groups had faced smaller but equally real versions of the same problem. A group needed leaders, memory, rules, and shared decisions, but no group could survive if confidence broke away from the world it depended on. Early humans learned under pressure from weather, hunger, distance, and danger. They could not build a city, but they already knew that life together required attention to limits. Plato's world had changed the scale of that ancient problem. Instead of one camp moving across a landscape, there were fleets, walls, colonies, laws, coinage, alliances, and arguments about justice. Yet the human body beneath the city remained the same, vulnerable to fear, desire, pride, fatigue, and loss. Atlantis becomes easier to understand when placed beside this wounded Athens. The story is not simply about a strange land beyond the known sea. It is about the possibility that greatness itself can become unstable when it forgets measure. Greek thinkers often use stories, comparisons, and imagined cities to test moral and political ideas. Plato did this with unusual depth. He asked what justice is, how education shapes desire, why rulers become corrupt, and whether a city can be ordered toward the good rather than toward appetite and conquest. Atlantis enters that field of questions. Its power is made visible so that its danger can also be felt. A rich and expanding society may appear awake, but it may be asleep to its own direction. After the trauma of war and civic breakdown, this image had weight. It allowed Plato to speak about decline without writing a simple chronicle of recent events. He could move the problem into an older frame, a story said to reach back beyond ordinary memory, and by doing so make Athens think about itself from a distance. That distance is important. Human beings often understand danger more clearly when it is placed outside the familiar world. A city can look at another city and see what it refuses to see in itself. Atlantis, in this sense, begins as a mirror polished by loss. Its sea, wealth, armies and destruction draw the mind outward, but the deeper pressure returns to Athens, to Plato, and to the recurring human question of whether civilization can remain wise after it becomes powerful. In Plato's design, Atlantis stands beside an image of Athens, but it is not simply another city in the story. It works as a contrast. On one side is a version of ancient Athens presented as disciplined, measured, protective, and guided by a higher idea of justice. On the other side is Atlantis, wealthy, vast, impressive, and pulled outward by desire for control. The contrast is not meant to be a fair travel report between two places. It is a moral instrument. Plato often built arguments by placing one form of life against another, so that the listener could feel the difference before naming it. Atlantis gives shape to the danger of a society whose outer strength has grown faster than its inner order. The imagined Athens, by contrast, becomes a model of restraint, not because every historical Athenian lived that way, but because Plato needed an image of civic balance. This is where the legend becomes less about a lost island and more about an old human struggle, how a community keeps power from becoming appetite. Long before any city could be called Athens, human groups survived by limiting desire through shared need. Food had to be divided, shelter had to be protected, children had to be watched. Dangerous choices could not be separated from the bodies that would suffer them. A small group could not pretend that its world was endless. Its members learned, through pressure, that survival depended on cooperation and self-control as much as strength. Plato's contrast between Athens and Atlantis enlarges that ancient lesson onto the scale of cities and empires. Atlantis has almost everything a society might envy. It has abundance, engineering, command over movement, and a wide reach across the sea. Yet in the story these gifts are not enough. They become signs of imbalance when they serve expansion without wisdom. The ideal Athens has less glitter, but its value lies in order of soul and order of city. It suggests that a society is not judged only by what it can build or conquer, but by what it can refuse. This distinction should be heard slowly, because it is easy to confuse the dazzling surface of Atlantis with the point of the tale. Plato is not inviting the listener to admire the island first and mourn it second. He is asking the listener to notice how magnificence can hide a moral drift. A harbour can be full, a palace can be bright, a fleet can be strong, but none of these things proves that a city understands itself. The story places Atlantis across the sea, beyond the familiar centre of Greek life, so that its size and distance can make it feel larger than politics. Yet the lesson turns back toward the city Plato knew. Athens had once led, persuaded, traded, fought, and imagined itself chosen for greatness. After defeat and inner turmoil, the question could no longer be avoided. What is greatness if it does not protect the life of the soul? Atlantis answers only indirectly. It shows a society where power has become motion, and motion has become conquest. That is why the opposition with Athens matters. It is a way of asking whether civilization should be measured by reach or by harmony. The earliest human communities had no monuments, but they already faced this measure in simpler form. A group that took too much from a place ignored warning signs, or allowed rivalry to break trust could endanger its own future. Later cities only made the pattern more elaborate. Atlantis is the grand version of the same danger, dressed in rings of land and sea. The ideal Athens is the counter-image, a reminder that order begins with limits. In Plato's hands, the legend becomes a quiet test of vision, whether the listener is more impressed by abundance or more awake to the discipline that keeps abundance from becoming ruin. A powerful empire destroyed by its own direction fits Plato because it turns a political idea into something the mind can see. If he had only said that greed weakens cities, the sentence might have remained flat. By giving that danger a body, a harbour, a royal house, a navy, and a sudden disappearance, he allowed the listener to feel how moral failure can become historical loss. Atlantis is not useful to his thought because it is strange. It is useful because it is recognizable. It shows a society that has learned how to organize matter, command labor, and cross the sea, yet has not learned how to remain inwardly measured. For Plato, this was one of the deepest civic problems. Human beings do not become safe simply by becoming more capable. A sharper tool can prepare food, or it can injure. A stronger wall can protect a town, or it can encourage a town to believe that nothing outside the wall matters. A larger fleet can connect people, or it can carry ambition farther than wisdom can follow. The same pattern reaches back to the beginning of human life together. Early groups survived because skill and restraint had to stay close. Fire, hunting, sharing, migration, and memory all required judgment. A group that became bold without attention could lose the path, exhaust a place, or break the trust that held bodies together in danger. Plato's age placed that ancient problem inside the scale of cities. Now the question was not only whether a small group could survive a season, but whether a whole society could survive its own success. Atlantis gives that question a vast and memorable shape. Its destruction also suits Plato because it avoids the comfort of blaming outside enemies. In many stories, a city falls because another power attacks it, a disaster strikes it, or fortune turns against it. In the Atlantis account, these pressures matter, but the deeper movement is moral decline. The island's people are described as losing the noble quality that once kept them ordered. The language belongs to Plato's world, but the human concern is broader and easier to understand. A community can inherit good rules and still hollow them out. It can repeat the old forms while changing the desires inside them. It can keep the temples, offices, laws, and ceremonies while slowly forgetting why restraint mattered. This is why the tale fits a philosopher who cared about education, character, and the inner life of the city. Plato often treated society as an enlarged soul. If the soul is ruled by appetite, it becomes restless. If a city is ruled by appetite, it expands without peace. Atlantis is the city as appetite made visible. Its wealth is not merely decoration, it is a test. Its size is not merely impressive, it is a burden. Its fall is not merely punishment, it is a way of showing that disorder can grow quietly before it becomes visible all at once. This idea would have felt close to Athens after war and political trauma. People had seen how public confidence could become reckless, how persuasion could detach from truth, and how civic pride could carry a community toward choices it later could not undo. Plato did not need to write a direct accusation to make the warning clear. By placing the story far away and long ago, he gave Athens a safe distance from which to examine itself. That distance is also why Atlantis continued to work for later generations. Every age can imagine that the fallen island is about another people, another place, another time. Yet the story keeps returning to the same human question. From the first camps near water to the great cities of the ancient sea, people have lived between need and desire, cooperation and domination, memory and forgetting. Atlantis fits Plato because it makes that tension vast and unforgettable. The Atlantis story reaches us through a chain of voices, and that chain is one of the most important things about it. Plato does not simply speak as a witness. He places the story inside a remembered account, where Critias says he heard it from his grandfather, who had received it through family tradition from Solon, the famous Athenian lawgiver. Solon, in the tale, had heard the older material from Egyptian priests. This layered path gives Atlantis a feeling of great age, but it also creates distance. Every voice stands between the listener and the supposed event. Every transfer of memory raises the same quiet question. What survives unchanged when a story travels across languages, families, cities, and centuries? The answer must be careful. We cannot treat such a chain as direct evidence in the way we would treat an inscription, a settlement layer, or a dated object in the ground. Yet we also should not ignore what the chain reveals about ancient ideas of memory and authority. In the world before printed books, memory did not move as a perfect copy. It moved through people. It passed through status, trust, ritual, age, and the weight given to respected names. A story linked to Egypt could sound older and more stable to a Greek audience, because Egypt was often imagined by Greeks as a land of ancient records and deep time. A story linked to Solon could sound politically serious, because Solon was remembered as a lawgiver and wise figure in Athenian tradition. Plato's framing, therefore, gives Atlantis a double character. It feels like inherited history, but it is also a crafted literary device. That tension is not a small detail. It is the ground on which the entire legend stands. Long before formal historians tried to separate evidence from tradition, human groups had already learned to carry the past through repeated telling. Around fires, paths, rivers, and shelters, early people would have remembered where danger had appeared, where food had been found, and where loss had happened. Such memory was never only decorative, it helped bodies survive in a changing world. But oral memory is shaped by use. The parts that matter most to a community tend to remain strong, while names, numbers, distances, and causes can shift. The same may be true, in a different way, of stories inside literate cultures. A tale can preserve a warning while changing its surface. It can attach itself to respected ancestors. It can borrow the authority of older places. It can become more precise in appearance while remaining uncertain in evidence. Atlantis is powerful partly because Plato makes it seem already ancient when it first appears. The listener is not standing at the beginning of the tale, but far downstream from it. The waters have passed through Egypt, through Solon, through family memory, through Critias, and finally through Plato's own written dialogue. That distance gives the story depth, but not certainty. It asks us to notice how easily human beings confuse depth with proof. A memory can feel old because it has many layers, yet layers can also hide the original shape. In archaeology, layers are read through soil, objects, and context. In storytelling, layers are read through voice, intention, repetition, and silence. Atlantis has many voices, but no confirmed material voice of its own. No Atlantean document has been found. No city has spoken from the seabed. What we have is a Greek philosophical text presenting an older report inside a conversation. That is enough to study seriously, but not enough to declare the island real as described. The chain from Solon to Egypt to Critias matters because it shows how Atlantis was made to feel both distant and intimate. It belongs to a past beyond ordinary reach, yet it arrives through family memory, as if history were being whispered across generations. That is exactly how many human stories survive, not as untouched facts, but as meaningful fragments carried by people who need the past to speak. Memory changes when it moves. That is not a weakness unique to Atlantis, and it is not proof that every old story is false. It is simply how human remembering works when the past must pass through living minds, changing languages, and the needs of each generation. A story told by a priest to a visitor, then carried into another culture, then kept inside a family, then placed inside a philosophical dialogue, is no longer close to a raw event. It has become shaped by selection. Some details are kept because they feel important. Some are forgotten because they no longer fit the audience. Some become clearer than they could ever have been in ordinary life, because stories often polish uncertainty into form. This matters deeply for Atlantis. The legend depends on distance for its power, but distance is also where distortion enters. Long before writing, human groups had to remember the world by repeating it. A safe path, a bitter plant, a dangerous animal, a floodplain, a season of hunger, a burial place, a night of fire, all could become anchors of shared knowledge. These memories were not stored like objects on a shelf. They lived in speech, gesture, rhythm, and place. They were useful because they helped bodies survive, yet the very act of retelling made them flexible. A warning might grow stronger so children would listen. A disaster might be tied to a place so later people would avoid it. A leader's choice might be simplified into wisdom or failure. Over generations, the story could remain meaningful while becoming less exact. That is why a responsible listener must separate two different kinds of truth. One kind asks whether a specific island, exactly as Plato described it, existed in the known past. That question needs material evidence, and so far, Atlantis has not provided it. Another kind asks whether the tale preserves old human concerns about water, power, loss, and the fragility of cities. That question can be answered more gently. Yes, those concerns are real, and they are rooted in experiences repeated across many human landscapes. Ancient texts can intensify this process because writing gives memory a surface of permanence. Once words are fixed, they can look stable, even when the material behind them was already layered. A written story may preserve an older oral report, but it may also arrange that report for argument, education, beauty, or moral force. Plato was not recording Atlantis in the manner of a modern excavation note. He was placing an inherited sounding account inside a conversation about order, justice, and decline. That does not mean he invented every image without influence. It means the form we possess has already passed through intention. Human beings often trust old writing because it seems closer to the lost beginning. But writing can also freeze a transformed memory and make later readers mistake the frozen shape for the original event. This is how Atlantis became so difficult to handle. It sounds ancient, precise, and geographical, yet its first secure home is literary and philosophical. It offers distances, kings, rings of land, and a great war, but those features do not turn into archaeology by themselves. They must be tested against the ground, the sea, and the wider record of ancient history. When that testing does not confirm the city, the story should not be forced into certainty. It should be read as a layered memory image, built from the human habit of carrying warnings forward. From the first spoken memories near rivers and coasts to the written dialogues of Greece, people have always changed the past while trying to protect it. Atlantis survives inside that tension, a story altered by transmission yet still powerful because it remembers the fear that even strong places can vanish, leaving later minds to wonder where memory ends and evidence must quietly begin, and why the boundary still matters so much. Atlantis shows how human beings can turn loss into a place. A fear without shape is difficult to hold for long, but a drowned island can be remembered, imagined, feared, and retold. In Plato's dialogue, the disappearance of Atlantis is not described as a slow fading. It is compressed into a powerful image of a society removed from the visible world. That compression is one reason the legend stayed alive. Real loss often arrives with confusion. People do not always understand, in the moment, why a settlement fails, why a coast changes, why a familiar order breaks, or why a generation inherits silence where names once stood. A story gives that confusion a boundary. It places grief inside a form the mind can revisit. Atlantis became such a form, an island that stands for vanished security, lost power, and the unsettling thought that even the most confident human arrangements may not be permanent. This habit is much older than Plato. At the beginning of human life, before archives, before philosophy, before kings and harbours, loss had to be remembered through story because survival depended on it. A group that forgot where the river flooded, where people had died, where animals became scarce, or where conflict had broken trust might repeat the danger. The first stories were not entertainment in the modern sense. They were ways of carrying attention across time. They helped one generation pass caution to another. In that deep human background, Atlantis feels familiar even when its details remain uncertain, because it belongs to the ancient practice of turning disappearance into warning. The island may not be confirmed as a historical city, but the fear it carries is historical in a wider sense. Human beings have repeatedly watched things vanish. Camps, languages, coastlines, families, kingdoms, and ways of living that once seemed ordinary. The mind does not easily accept disappearance without asking for a pattern. It wants to know whether pride caused it, whether water took it, whether the gods judged it, whether people ignored signs, or whether all human order is more fragile than it appears. Plato's story gathers these questions without needing to answer them in the way modern evidence would require. It gives loss a moral architecture. Atlantis is not only gone, it is gone after becoming too powerful, too ambitious, too far from restraint. That is why the legend can feel emotionally complete, even where the evidence is incomplete. It satisfies the human desire for meaning, while leaving the historian with the duty to remain careful. This is also why Atlantis can absorb many later memories and anxieties. A person hearing about it may think of storms, earthquakes, ruined cities, sinking shores, or the quiet erosion of a society from within. The story is wide enough to receive these fears because it is not attached, by confirmed evidence, to one excavated place. Its uncertainty becomes part of its strength. Yet that same uncertainty must not be turned into false certainty. A responsible reading allows Atlantis to be meaningful without forcing it to be literal. It can show how people remember the danger of collapse, how they imagine the sea as a keeper of vanished worlds, and how they use stories to place moral order around events that may otherwise feel senseless. From early humans watching landscapes change to ancient Greeks debating justice and power, the same need remains visible. The need to protect memory from emptiness. Atlantis endures because it offers a quiet answer to that need, not by proving where a lost city lies, but by giving human fear a shoreline, a name, and a silence deep enough for every later age to hear its own losses within it. The Mediterranean world made Atlantis feel believable because it was a world where water connected life and threatened it at the same time. Around that sea, people did not live beside empty blue space. They lived beside a moving road. Islands, harbours, straits, winds, reefs, and seasonal currents shaped how communities traded, fought, travelled, and imagined the limits of the known world. A city near the coast could receive grain, timber, metal, oil, wine, pottery, stories, and strangers from far away. The same coast could also bring storms, shipwrecks, raids, earthquakes, and sudden hunger if the routes failed. This balance between gift and danger is important for understanding why a legend like Atlantis could take root in the mind. It belongs to a region where the sea was never only scenery. It was a condition of civilization. The old human relationship with water goes much deeper than cities. Before there were ports or fleets, human groups followed rivers, crossed shorelines, gathered shellfish, watched tides, and learned that water could feed the body while also changing the ground beneath it. The beginning of human life was not separated from landscape. Survival depended on reading places carefully, where fresh water could be found, where storms gathered, where animals moved, where a path became unsafe. Later, Mediterranean societies enlarged that ancient knowledge into networks. Instead of one group moving through one local world, many communities became tied together across a sea. That made life richer but also more fragile. A palace economy, a harbour town, or an island settlement could depend on goods and signals arriving from beyond the horizon. If ships stopped coming, if a harvest failed elsewhere, if a war closed a route, or if an earthquake damaged a port, trouble could travel through the network quietly before appearing as crisis. Atlantis, with its rings of land and sea and its reach across waters, fits that kind of imagination. It does not need to be treated as a confirmed map to reflect a real Mediterranean awareness. The sea could make a society powerful, and the same sea could remind it that power rested on unstable conditions. Islands especially carried this double meaning. They could feel protected because water separated them from enemies. They could feel exposed because water also separated them from help. They could become centres of trade because ships passed near them. They could also become isolated if routes shifted, harbours silted, winds turned dangerous, or larger powers competed around them. Ancient people knew that the edge of land was not a fixed comfort. Shorelines erode, keys break, ships vanish, and earthquakes can alter the relation between land and sea. In the Eastern Mediterranean, real societies rose from maritime skill, exchange, craft production, and contact across islands and coasts. Their lives were not simple, and responsible history avoids making any single event explain every change. But the broad pattern is clear enough. Human communities around the sea depended on an environment that was generous, complex, and never fully controlled. That is the quiet background against which Atlantis can be heard. The legend imagines a power whose identity is tied to the sea, whose wealth seems to come from command over movement, and whose fall is described through a sudden removal from the world people can see. For listeners shaped by a maritime world, such an image would not feel random. It would echo the known vulnerability of coastal life. From the earliest humans learning the moods of water to the later cities sending ships beyond sight of land, civilization has always depended on forces it cannot completely master. Atlantis stands near that ancient boundary, where the sea gives roots, memory, wealth, fear, and finally the thought that a whole human order can rest on the edge of change. The ancient Mediterranean held memories of real disruption, even if none of them can be placed neatly over Atlantis like a transparent map. Palaces burned, harbour towns weakened, trade routes changed, and written systems in some regions fell silent or became harder to trace. In the later Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated peoples living apart from one another. It was a connected world of ships, metals, grain, diplomacy, skilled craft, royal courts, and fragile agreements. Goods moved across long distances. Messengers carried letters between rulers. Cities depended on materials they could not always produce at home. When pressure came, it did not need to destroy everything at once in order to change the shape of life. A broken route could mean fewer tools. Fewer tools could mean weaker harvests, weaker defense, less trust, and more migration. A damaged port could send strain inland. A drought or conflict in one region could be felt by people who had never seen that region with their own eyes. This is why the collapse of real Bronze Age societies matters for the Atlantis legend. It does not prove Atlantis. It gives us the kind of historical atmosphere in which a story about a brilliant power brought down by forces larger than itself could feel natural. Human beings had known disruption from the beginning, but the scale had changed. Early groups might lose a camp, a hunting ground, a water source, or a safe passage through a valley. Later societies could lose archives, palaces, fleets, workshops, and the habits that allowed thousands of people to live in coordination. The body still needed food, shelter, safety, and memory, but civilization had placed those needs inside wider systems. When those systems shook, the shock could feel almost unreal. Archaeology does show that important centres around the Eastern Mediterranean suffered destruction, abandonment, or major transformation during the end of the Bronze Age, though scholars do not reduce this to one simple cause: war, internal stress, changing trade, climate pressure, movement of peoples, earthquake damage, and political fragility may have worked together in different ways across different places. That careful language is important. Sleepy wonder should never become false certainty. The real record is complex, uneven, and regional, but complexity itself helps explain Atlantis. A legend can take many scattered fears and compress them into one image. Instead of many towns weakening over years, a story gives one island. Instead of many causes, it gives a moral direction. Instead of slow breakdown, it gives disappearance. Around the Mediterranean, people could look at ruins and know that earlier orders had not lasted forever. A palace could become debris. A written language could lose its readers. A port that once welcomed ships could become quiet. These were not imaginary experiences. They belonged to human history, and they entered the background of later storytelling. From the first humans who carried memory across generations, loss became meaningful only when it could be told. A place abandoned by grandparents could become a lesson for grandchildren. A shoreline changed by water could become a boundary in the mind. A fallen city could become proof that power has a season. Atlantis gathered that old pattern into a single unforgettable form. It is not necessary to claim that Plato was secretly describing one known Bronze Age collapse. It is safer and more honest to say that his story lived in a world where collapse was thinkable, where the sea linked societies together, and where the ruins of earlier powers could still press quietly against imagination. The legend sounds larger than life because it stands near many real losses, without becoming identical to any one of them. Atlantis could receive many different memories because it was never tied down by confirmed ruins. A city that has been excavated belongs, with all its broken pottery and dated layers, to one place. A legend without such evidence can drift through many places at once. This is one reason Atlantis became so durable. It could stand near the memory of island societies, near the fear of earthquakes, near stories of floods, near the fall of Bronze Age palaces, and near the ordinary human grief of seeing a familiar world disappear. None of these memories proves Atlantis as a literal kingdom, but together they help explain why the tale felt spacious enough for later minds to enter. The Mediterranean was full of real coastlines where people had watched the sea change the terms of life. Some harbours prospered, some weakened, some settlements moved. Some ruins stood as reminders that earlier arrangements had ended. The story of Atlantis gave all these scattered impressions one calm but powerful shape, a great place across the water, remembered at the moment it vanished. This is how human memory often works. It does not always preserve the past as a clean line of separate events. It gathers related feelings into images. At the beginning of human life, long before writing, a group might remember many dangers through one landmark: a cliff where animals fell, a river bend where floods came, a grove where food was found, a shore where people did not return. The place became a vessel for layered knowledge. Later civilizations did something similar with stories. A single tale could hold fear of nature, distrust of pride, memories of older ruins, and warnings about political ambition. Atlantis became a vessel of that kind. Its uncertainty allowed it to absorb many echoes without being identical to them. This is why the legend can seem to resemble more than one historical event. Some listeners notice the sea, others notice the island, others notice the sudden disaster, others notice the empire, the moral decline, the wealth, or the memory said to come from Egypt. Each feature points toward real patterns in the ancient world, but none of them settles the question by itself. A responsible reading lets the echoes remain echoes. It does not force them into a single, secret answer. If a real city falls, archaeology asks where, when, how, and by what evidence. If a legend survives, history also asks why people kept telling it. Atlantis became useful because it could hold more than location. It could hold the feeling that the human world is made from arrangements that can break. Trade can break. Trust can break. Shorelines can break. Political balance can break. Even memory can break, leaving later generations with fragments that feel meaningful but incomplete. From the first small communities to the maritime societies of the ancient sea, people lived by joining the present to what had been learned before. When that chain weakened, the world became harder to read. Atlantis is a story about such a break, shaped as geography. It turns many possible losses into one island and one disappearance. That is why it can be connected, cautiously, with the broader human experience of collapse without being reduced to any one collapse. It belongs to Plato's text first, but it draws strength from older and wider realities: water as danger, wealth as temptation, memory as fragile, and civilization as something built by human hands in places that never stop changing. Later readers could carry their own vanished shores into it, without noticing that they were adding another layer to the tale. Its power comes from that mixture. Atlantis is not one proven ruin waiting patiently beneath the waves. It is a meeting place of remembered fears, historical shadows, and the old human need to give loss a name. Among the real events often brought into the Atlantis discussion, the eruption of Thera stands closest to the edge between evidence and imagination. Thera, the volcanic island now associated with Santorini in the Aegean Sea, did suffer a major eruption in the Bronze Age. The event was enormous by human standards. It changed the island, sent ash into the region, and affected the surrounding maritime world in ways that archaeologists and geologists continue to study carefully. It also occurred near the world of the Minoans, a real Bronze Age civilization centered on Crete, known for palaces, trade, art, writing systems, and wide contact across the sea. Because Plato's Atlantis is described as an island power, rich, skilled, maritime, and later destroyed, many people have wondered whether some distant memory of Thera and the Minoan world may have helped shape the legend. That possibility is understandable. It is also not the same as proof. The eruption of Thera gives us something concrete: layers of ash, volcanic deposits, buried buildings, and a landscape altered by geological force. Atlantis gives us something different: a philosophical story written much later, framed through memory and moral argument. The two can be compared, but they cannot simply be folded into one another without losing honesty. The appeal of the Thera connection begins with the sea. In the Aegean, islands were not isolated stones in empty water. They were stepping places for trade, ritual, craft, and political contact. The Minoan world depended on maritime movement, and its art and architecture show a society comfortable with ships, coastlines, storage, ceremony, and exchange. A volcanic disaster in such a world would not have been only a local event. Ash could affect land. Tsunami waves may have reached nearby coasts. Trade routes and coastal settlements could have felt disruption, though the exact scale and long-term consequences are still studied and debated. Early humans, long before palaces, already knew that water and fire from the earth were forces beyond command. A shoreline could feed a group for years, then change after one violent day. A mountain could seem still for generations, then open. The body remembers such danger through fear, story, and caution. In a later Bronze Age society, the same ancient vulnerability remained, only surrounded by more elaborate systems. Storehouses, ships, workshops, and ports could make life more productive, but they also gave disaster more pathways through which to travel. Thera is therefore important because it shows that the ancient Mediterranean really did contain dramatic natural events capable of shaking human confidence. It gives historical weight to the idea that island societies could be altered by forces from the sea and the earth. Yet care is needed at every step. The Minoans did not disappear in a single instant like the dramatic Atlantis image. Their history after the eruption was complex. Some sites continued, some changed. Later pressures, including political and cultural shifts in the Aegean, also mattered. Archaeology does not support a simple story in which Thera erupts and an entire civilization is immediately erased, nor does Plato's geography, chronology, and moral structure match Thera neatly. The legend is too shaped by his philosophical concerns to be treated as a hidden report of Santorini under another name. Still, Thera helps us understand why Atlantis feels plausible to the imagination. It reminds us that behind many myths of sudden loss, there may stand real human experiences of unstable ground, darkened skies, damaged shores, interrupted trade, and communities trying to explain what changed. From the first people watching smoke on a horizon to Bronze Age islanders living near a volcanic sea, human beings have always placed memory between nature and fear. Thera does not solve Atlantis, but it shows the kind of world in which a story about a brilliant island power and a terrible environmental break could continue to breathe. The Minoan world is one of the reasons Atlantis continues to feel close to history, because the Minoans were real, impressive, maritime, and later transformed in ways that invite comparison. They lived on Crete and across parts of the Aegean, leaving palaces, painted walls, seal stones, storage rooms, roads, ritual spaces, and writing that scholars still study. Their world was not a fantasy of golden cities under the sea. It was a human society made from labour, food, craft, exchange, administration, and memory. When people look at the palace at Knossos or at the buried settlement of Akrotiri on Thera, it is easy to understand why Atlantis is often pulled toward this region. Here were islands, ships, wealth, art, sudden geological danger, and later cultural change. Yet the careful step is to say that resemblance is not identity. A real civilization can echo a legend without becoming the legend itself. The Minoans did not call themselves Atlanteans in any evidence we have. Their sites do not match Plato's description in a simple way. Their decline was not a single clean vanishing in one day. It was a complex historical process shaped by many pressures, including the eruption of Thera, changing relations with mainland Greece, economic and political shifts, and other conditions still debated. Responsible history must let that complexity remain. Long before palaces, early human communities already learned that a place could be rich and dangerous at the same time. A shore could feed a family, but storms could take it. A cave could shelter a group, but only while the surrounding land still provided water and food. The Minoan world stands at a later and larger scale of the same human condition. Its people built systems that depended on harvests, storage, skilled workers, ships, and trusted routes. That made life more organized, but also made disruption more complicated. If one layer failed, another could feel the strain. This is very different from the clean image of Atlantis sinking out of sight. Archaeology usually does not give us such simple endings. It gives us layers, repairs, imports, changes in pottery, altered buildings, burned rooms, reused spaces, and signs that life continued differently after stress. The Minoans are important because they show what a brilliant Aegean civilization could look like, not because they provide a finished answer to Atlantis. Their art suggests attention to animals, plants, sea creatures, movement, ceremony, and the beauty of the living world. Their buildings suggest administration and social organization. Their maritime connections suggest a society whose identity was tied to movement across water. These features help explain why later readers imagine Atlantis through a Minoan lens. But Plato's Atlantis is also a moral and political construction. It is an aggressive imperial power placed against an idealized Athens. The Minoan record, as far as it is understood, cannot be reduced to that role. Turning the Minoans into Atlantis can quietly damage both stories. It flattens a real civilization into a mystery label, and it turns Plato's philosophical warning into a treasure hunt. From the first human groups to the cities of the Bronze Age, the past deserves more patience than that. People did not live as clues for a future legend. They lived full lives inside their own world, with food to store, children to raise, rituals to perform, work to finish, and dangers to interpret. The honest connection between Minoan Crete and Atlantis is therefore indirect. The Minoan world helps us imagine the kind of maritime brilliance and environmental vulnerability that could feed a legend, but it does not confirm the island Plato described. It reminds us that the real story of Atlantis begins with a text, then gathers echoes from real human histories without becoming identical to them. The most honest place to stand with Thera, the Minoans, and Atlantis is between rejection and certainty. It would be too narrow to say that real Aegean disasters have nothing to do with the later imagination of lost islands. It would be too careless to say that they prove Atlantis was Santorini, Crete, or any other known place. The better answer is slower. Thera and the Minoan world show that the Eastern Mediterranean did contain island societies, maritime wealth, volcanic destruction, and cultural transformation. These are real conditions, supported by physical evidence. They help explain why Plato's story can feel historically textured. But a texture is not an identification. The moment a possibility is treated as proof, the legend begins to move away from evidence and toward wishful certainty. This boundary matters because Atlantis has always tempted people to fill empty spaces too quickly. A ring-shaped harbour, a buried town, a ruined wall, a memory of a flood, or a volcanic island may seem to call the legend toward it. The human mind likes completion. It wants fragments to become a single picture. That desire is ancient. Long before writing, early humans survived by connecting signs. A track in mud, a cloud line, a broken branch, a smell of smoke, a change in animal movement. Pattern recognition helped bodies live through uncertainty. But the same ability can also mislead. A sign can be real, while the story built around it goes too far. Atlantis sits exactly in that delicate place. Thera is real. Minoan Crete is real. Bronze Age disruption is real. Plato's text is real. The direct equation between them is not confirmed. A reasonable hypothesis asks whether memories of Aegean disasters, maritime power, or older collapses could have contributed to the atmosphere from which Atlantis took shape. That is a careful question. It does not claim more than the evidence allows. It leaves room for influence, echo, and analogy. An unproven conclusion does something different. It declares that Atlantis has been found, that Plato was describing a specific archaeological site, or that a known civilization was secretly the lost kingdom, even when the details do not fit securely. The difference may seem small in popular storytelling, but it is large in honest history. History is not only the search for dramatic answers, it is also the discipline of stopping where the evidence stops. This is especially important for sleep audio built around trust. The listener does not need to be pushed into a false revelation. The listener can be invited into a calmer and more valuable understanding, that the past is often made of overlapping layers, some material, some literary, some remembered, some imagined. Thera may have contributed to later fears about islands and sudden destruction. The Minoan world may have given later minds an example of maritime sophistication and vulnerability. Other Mediterranean memories may have added their own weight. Plato may have shaped all of this, or none of it directly, into a philosophical warning. What remains clear is that Atlantis, as we possess it, belongs first to his written dialogue. From there, it opens onto a wider human landscape of fragile coasts and fragile societies, from the first people reading Danger in the Ground to later scholars reading ash layers and palace ruins. Human beings have always tried to understand what traces mean. The task is not to silence wonder, it is to keep wonder awake. A careful mind can look at Thera and feel the force of real catastrophe. It can look at the Minoans and respect the fullness of a real civilization. It can look at Atlantis and understand why the legend still pulls at memory. But it does not need to collapse all three into one final answer. The real story becomes stronger, not weaker, when the unknown is allowed to remain unknown. Water remains in human memory because it changes the body's world directly. A ruler can die far away, a palace name can fade, and a border can be redrawn by people who never touch the soil. But a flood enters the place where people sleep, eat, store grain, bury kin, and teach children where it is safe to walk. It does not remain only an event. It becomes a before and after in the landscape. The same is true of earthquakes and sudden waves. The ground that seemed dependable moves. The harbour that seemed protective turns violent. The shore that marked the edge of home is no longer where memory placed it. For people living near the Mediterranean and other ancient seas, these were not imaginary dangers. Earthquakes, storm surges, coastal erosion, and local sea changes belonged to the natural world they inhabited. Even if they did not understand the forces in the terms used by modern geology, a story such as Atlantis draws power from that old human knowledge. It imagines a society not merely defeated by an army, but removed by the meeting of earth and water, the two elements that make settled life possible and also place limits around it. Long before written records, early humans had to learn water with the whole body. They followed rivers for drinking, animals, plants, and movement. They rested near lakes, crossed shallows, gathered along coasts, and watched the sky for signs that rain might change a path. Water could mean life, but too much water, arriving too quickly, could erase the very ground on which life had been organized. A camp could be moved, a small group could flee a rising stream, but once human communities built storehouses, harbours, fields and shrines, the relationship changed. More memory was attached to fixed places. More labour was invested in walls, paths and ports. More generations were buried in the same ground. When water entered such a world, it threatened not only bodies but continuity. That is why flood stories often last. They do not remember only wetness or danger. They remember the breaking of a trusted arrangement between people and place. Atlantis belongs to this family of thought, though it reaches us through Plato and must not be treated as independent proof of a real flood. Its drowned image feels convincing because human societies have repeatedly known how water can change history without asking permission. A tsunami may leave traces along a coast. An earthquake may lift or drop land. A harbour may be damaged or made useless. A river may silt, shift, or overwhelm its banks. None of these processes automatically creates an Atlantis, but they create the mental world in which Atlantis can be believed. When later listeners heard of an island power swallowed by disaster, they did not need to imagine an impossible kind of fear. They already lived in bodies descended from people who survived by watching unstable places carefully. The beginning of human memory is therefore never far from the legend. Our ancestors did not separate environment from story because survival did not allow such a separation. What happened to land and water happened to the group. What happened to the group had to be carried forward in words, rituals, place names, and caution. In a coastal world, a story about land lost to the sea could become a vessel for many real experiences. A family displaced, a harbour ruined, a field salted, a town abandoned, a coastline remembered by elders but not by children. The deeper truth is not that Atlantis must be one of these events. The deeper truth is that such events made Atlantis understandable. Water gave the legend its emotional gravity. Earthquakes gave it suddenness, human memory gave it duration, and the fragile edge between shore and sea gave later generations a place to imagine how quickly a human world can become unreachable. A disaster does not end when the water pulls back. For the people, a child who hears that the sea once entered a sleeping village may grow up with a different feeling toward the shore. A family that loses fields to saltwater may teach caution without needing to explain every detail. A community that rebuilds after an earthquake may keep certain places empty, avoid certain seasons, or repeat a story whenever clouds, tremors, or tides begin to feel wrong. In this way, environmental disaster can leave traces that are not only physical. Some traces lie in sand, broken walls, shifted stones, or abandoned layers. Others remain in gestures, warnings, names, silences, and the feeling that the world can change faster than human planning can follow. Atlantis belongs to that second kind of trace. It is not evidence for a confirmed disaster by itself, but it carries the emotional shape of disaster remembered beyond the people who first felt it. Early human life depended on this kind of transmission. Long before writing, a group did not survive by forgetting pain once the danger had passed. It survived by turning pain into caution. If a river crossing had killed someone, the memory of that place mattered. If a dry season had brought hunger, the memory of timing mattered. If a storm had taken shelters near the water, the next generation needed to know where not to sleep. These memories were not written in formal records. They were written into behavior. They became routes chosen and routes avoided, foods trusted and foods feared, places loved and places watched from a distance. Over time, the original event could become less clear, while the warning remained strong. A story of a wave might become a story of a whole land swallowed. A memory of broken houses might become a memory of a proud city punished. A local loss might become a moral lesson large enough for many people to share. This does not mean memory is false. It means memory often preserves importance more strongly than precision. Plato's Atlantis can be read within this human pattern. Its destruction is sudden, complete, and morally charged. It gives later listeners a way to think about the kind of loss that exceeds ordinary explanation. In real life, disasters rarely arrive with one clean meaning. A flood may be caused by weather, land shape, sea movement, and human settlement choices. An earthquake may damage one place severely while leaving another standing. A society may suffer because natural stress meets political weakness, economic strain, or poor preparation. Human memory, however, often seeks a clearer form than reality provides. It asks what the event meant. It asks what people should have learned. It asks whether pride, neglect, or blindness played a role. Atlantis answers those questions through image rather than proof. A great society stands near the sea, it grows wealthy, it reaches outward. Then the ground of its confidence disappears. For communities living near real coasts, this image could hold many inherited fears. The beginning of human society was always shaped by the need to pass such fears forward without freezing the mind in terror. A useful warning had to be strong enough to remember, but calm enough to live with. That balance may be one reason stories endure longer than raw fear. They make danger speakable. They allow a community to place disaster into time, to give it a before and an after, to let children inherit caution without inheriting only panic. Atlantis has survived in that gentle but persistent way. It is a literary story from Plato, yet it carries the deeper human rhythm of disaster becoming memory, memory becoming warning, and warning becoming a legend that later generations still feel in the body when they imagine the sea moving over a world that once seemed secure. Atlantis sits within a much wider human habit of imagining land taken by water. Many cultures have told stories about floods, drowned places, broken shores, or worlds that ended beneath rising water. These stories are not all the same, and they should not be forced into one origin. Some may reflect local floods, some may be moral tales, some may carry religious meanings, some may preserve memory of real environmental change reshaped by generations of retelling. What matters for Atlantis is not that every flood story secretly proves one lost civilization. That would be too simple, and it would turn human memory into a puzzle with only one answer. The more careful point is quieter. People everywhere have known that water can erase the boundary between safety and danger. A valley can fill, a coast can retreat, A river can leave its channel. An island can become unreachable. When such things happen, people do not remember only the physical event. They remember the feeling that the world they trusted had limits they had not fully understood. Atlantis belongs to this family of images because it places civilization at the exact edge where land, memory, pride, and water meet. From the beginning of human life, water was never only background. It shaped routes, diets, settlements, migrations, and the rhythm of daily survival. Early humans learned to live near water because life required it, but they also learned that the same source of life could become sudden danger. That old double meaning did not disappear when people built cities. It became larger. A small group could move after a flood, but a city carried heavier roots. It held stored grain, temples, graves, workshops, roads, walls, and the memory of many generations. When water threatened such a place, it threatened not only shelter, but identity. That is why drowned land stories can become so strong. They describe a loss deeper than damaged buildings. They describe the breaking of a relationship between people and the ground that had held them. Plato's Atlantis uses that image with great force. The island is not merely conquered or abandoned, it is removed from ordinary reach. It passes from geography into memory. In that movement it resembles many traditions in which water marks a boundary between an older world and a later one. Yet a responsible reading must keep the differences clear. Atlantis comes to us through Plato's dialogues. Other flood traditions come from other languages, places, rituals, and historical experiences. They should be respected in their own settings, not gathered carelessly into one grand claim. Still, the recurring presence of flood memory tells us something about the human condition. People remember what changes the ground under them. They remember what forces a group to move, rebuild, mourn, or explain loss to children who did not see it. The first human communities depended on such memory to survive across generations. A warning about water could be practical, sacred, emotional, and historical at the same time. Later societies gave those warnings larger forms, with kings, cities, gods, punishments, migrations, and vanished lands. Atlantis is one of the most enduring of those forms because it joins environmental fear to moral fear. It is not only land lost to water, it is a powerful society imagined as losing its balance before the water comes. That combination makes the legend especially memorable. It speaks to people who fear natural disaster, but also to people who fear social blindness. A flood can arrive from outside human control, yet a story can ask whether pride made people less able to see their vulnerability. In this sense, Atlantis does not stand alone. It stands among humanity's many attempts to remember that the earth is older than civilization, the sea is wider than human planning, and every settled life rests on conditions that must be noticed before they are lost. A real archaeological site begins with material traces that can be located, measured, compared, and tested against the wider record of human life. It may be a wall, a hearth, a burial, a harbour floor, a layer of ash, a tool, a potsherd, a food remain, or a mark left by repeated use of the same ground. Such traces do not speak in complete sentences, they are slow evidence. They need context, dating, comparison, and caution. A legend works differently. It may contain places, names, distances, and images that sound geographical, but unless those details can be tied securely to evidence outside the story, they remain within the world of the text. Atlantis is powerful because it looks like geography while arriving first as literature. It has rings, canals, wealth, kings, ships, and a dramatic end. Yet those features come to us through Plato's dialogue, not through an excavated Atlantean city. That difference should not make the listener colder toward the story. It should make the listener more careful. Human beings began reading traces long before archaeology had a name. Early people looked at footprints, broken branches, animal bones, smoke, watermarks, and changing soil because their bodies depended on such signs. To know what had happened in a place could mean knowing where to walk, where to wait, where to leave, or where danger might return. Archaeology is a disciplined descendant of that ancient human attention. It asks the ground to answer, but it does not force the ground to say more than it can. A literary legend asks for another kind of listening, It tells us how people imagined loss, power, justice, and memory. It can be historically valuable even when it is not a direct report. The mistake comes when these two forms of knowledge are blurred. If a submerged formation looks circular, that alone does not make it Atlantis. If a coastal ruin suffered flooding, that alone does not make it Atlantis. If an ancient culture was maritime and wealthy, that alone does not make it Atlantis. Similarity is a beginning for a question, not the end of inquiry. A confirmed site needs many lines of evidence to converge: location, date, material, culture, environmental context, inscriptions when available, and a fit with what is already known. Even then, good history remains open to revision. Atlantis has not met that burden. There is no accepted archaeological discovery that identifies a real city matching Plato's island kingdom. What exists instead is a long history of proposed locations, some imaginative, some more cautious, but none confirmed by the standards used for ancient sites. This distinction protects the past from being turned into scenery for desire. Real ancient people lived in the places archaeologists study. They ate, worked, repaired tools, raised children, buried the dead, feared storms, and made decisions under limits they did not choose. From the earliest human camps to the cities of the Mediterranean, every trace deserves to be read for its own world, not forced into the shape of a famous legend. Atlantis can still matter deeply as a story, but it should not swallow the identities of real societies whose remains have different histories. The quieter truth is more respectful. A site belongs to the ground that holds it. A legend belongs first to the language that carries it. Sometimes the two may meet when texts and objects support one another. With Atlantis, that meeting has not happened. This patience is not a refusal of wonder. It is the older human discipline of waiting beside a trace until the trace itself, not our hunger for completion, tells us what can be known for a while. So the responsible path is to let the legend remain visible, to let archaeology remain honest, and to understand that mystery does not become stronger when evidence is ignored. It becomes stronger when evidence is allowed to keep its silence. Atlantis has often been attached to shapes seen from a distance: a line under shallow water, a circle on a satellite image, a wall-like ridge, a grid in stone, a terrace on the seabed, or a pattern that seems too orderly to be natural. These images are powerful because the eye wants the world to mean something. When a pattern appears beneath water, the mind quickly begins to ask whether human hands made it, whether a lost harbour lies there, whether a road has survived, or whether an old city is waiting below the waves. That desire is understandable. It comes from one of the oldest human abilities, the ability to read signs in the environment before danger or opportunity becomes obvious. Long before writing, before maps, before measured history, early humans survived by noticing patterns in tracks, stones, clouds, animal movement, broken branches, and the sound of water. A faint mark could mean food. A repeated shape could mean a path. A disturbed surface could mean another living body had passed there. Pattern seeking helped our species live. But the same gift can mislead when the pattern is real and the interpretation goes too far. The sea is full of forms that look designed when seen from above or through poor images. Currents move sand into ridges, waves cut platforms, coral grows in repeated structures. Volcanic rock can fracture into straight lines, sediment can settle along edges, ancient shorelines can leave terraces that look planned. Even human-made objects can be misunderstood if they are moved, broken, or removed from their original context. A stone block in water is not enough. A straight line is not enough. A circle is not enough. To identify an archaeological place, evidence must gather slowly around the claim. There must be tools, ceramics, building methods, datable layers, environmental context, and a relationship to known human activity. Without that gathering, an image remains an image, not a civilization. Atlantis attracts misreadings because Plato's description offers strong visual hooks: rings of land and sea, canals, harbours, a great island power, and sudden disappearance. When people later see circular islands, submerged ridges, or geometric marks, the old story provides a ready frame. The frame arrives before the evidence. Once that happens, every feature may begin to look like confirmation. A natural ridge becomes a wall. A sandbar becomes a road. A shadow becomes an entrance. A broken coastline becomes the edge of a lost empire. This is not because people are foolish. It is because human perception works by comparison. We see what we are prepared to see. The first humans needed that speed. A slow mind might miss danger. Modern history needs a slower mind. It must ask what else the pattern could be, who has studied it, how it was dated, what material was recovered, and whether other specialists accept the interpretation. Satellite images and underwater photographs can begin questions, but they cannot finish them alone. They flatten depth, hide scale, distort color, and remove the patient work of excavation. A place underwater is especially difficult because waves, storms, sediments, and marine life change what can be seen. Honest curiosity must therefore move at the pace of evidence, not at the pace of recognition. Atlantis remains unfound, not because every strange shape has been ignored, but because strange shapes have not produced the full body of proof needed to confirm Plato's island kingdom. The wiser response is not to stop looking at the sea. It is to look without surrendering judgment. The ocean may hold many real traces of past human life, including harbours, wrecks, drowned shorelines, and settlements altered by rising water. Each deserves study on its own terms, but none should be forced to wear the name Atlantis before the evidence can carry that weight. A true discovery can wait for proof, because patience protects both wonder and the people who once lived. The safest way to keep curiosity alive is to let it breathe beside evidence, not ahead of evidence. Atlantis invites wonder because it stands at the edge of several real things: ancient philosophy, maritime worlds, volcanic islands, coastal disaster, political fear, and the human memory of loss. None of those things should be dismissed. Each one gives the legend depth, but depth is not the same as proof. A careful listener can feel the pull of the story while still noticing where the ground becomes uncertain. That balance is important, because false certainty can damage both history and imagination. When someone declares that Atlantis has certainly been found, the mystery becomes smaller, not larger. It is forced into one object, one map, one shoreline, one claim. The wider human question disappears. Instead of asking why the legend survived, why Plato shaped it as he did, why people connect water with loss, and why vanished civilizations trouble the mind, the story becomes only a hunt for confirmation. Curiosity deserves better than that. It deserves patience. From the beginning of human life, curiosity was never merely decoration. Early humans asked questions with their bodies before they asked them in formal words. What made that sound in the dark? Where did the animals go? Why did the river rise? Which plants could be eaten? Who passed this way before us? These questions helped a vulnerable species endure. They were tied to hunger, danger, sleep, kinship, and the need to understand traces in the world. But survival also required restraint. A mistaken sign could lead a group into danger. A false pattern could waste energy or create fear where none was needed. The human mind therefore needed two movements together: the openness to notice and the discipline to test. Atlantis asks for the same two movements now. We can notice the beauty of the legend, the force of the sea, the resemblance to real disasters, and the memory of ancient societies that changed or fell. We can also test each claim against what is known, and stop before turning possibility into fact. This does not make the story dry. It makes it trustworthy. Honest wonder is quieter than spectacle, but it lasts longer. It allows the listener to imagine without being misled. It allows the past to remain complex. It allows real ancient people to keep their own histories rather than being absorbed into a famous name. A Minoan pot, a Bronze Age harbour, a submerged shoreline, or a volcanic ash layer does not need to be Atlantis in order to matter. Each trace already belongs to the long human effort to live with water, land, memory, and change. When we respect that, the legend becomes more useful, not less. It becomes a lesson in how to think. It teaches that an old text can carry meaning without being a literal map. It teaches that absence of proof is not permission to invent proof. It teaches that uncertainty can be held gently, without panic and without exaggeration. In a world filled with fast claims and bright images, that lesson has value. Atlantis can still be approached with wonder, but the wonder should move slowly, like a careful hand over old stone. It should ask what is known, what is possible, what is only imagined, and why the imagined has such power. The real story does not close the sea. It simply asks us to look at it with clearer eyes, remembering that curiosity becomes deepest when it remains faithful to truth. That habit reaches back to the oldest nights of our species, when a sound beyond the fire could be threat, animal, wind, or nothing at all. To live, people had to wonder, but they also had to wait, compare, and listen. Atlantis asks for that ancient patience again. A quiet mind can hold both wonder and care without needing an invented false ending. In the ancient world, Atlantis was not yet the modern mystery it would later become. It was first a story inside Plato's philosophy, and for many early readers its force came from the lesson it carried rather than from the hope of finding a sunken city. The island mattered because it allowed people to think about power, virtue, pride, and downfall. It stood as a warning about a society that had become rich and expansive, yet had lost the inner measure that might have kept its strength from turning dangerous. Ancient readers did not all approach Plato in the same way, and the history of interpretation is never perfectly simple, but the early life of the Atlantis story remained close to the world of ideas. It belonged to conversations about the good city, the corruption of power, the memory of earlier ages, and the fragile line between order and ruin. That is very different from the later habit of treating Atlantis mainly as a lost target on a map. To understand this older reading, it helps to remember how human stories began. Long before philosophy, people used stories to keep moral and practical attention alive. A tale about a dangerous place could teach caution. A tale about a proud person could teach restraint. A tale about a vanished settlement could make loss easier to remember. The first human communities did not separate survival from meaning. What helped the group live also helped the group understand. Plato's Atlantis continues that deep habit in a literate and philosophical form. It turns a political warning into a place, and it turns social danger into geography. During later antiquity and the medieval centuries, Atlantis did not disappear completely, but it also did not occupy the center of historical curiosity in the way it does for many modern audiences. Classical texts survived unevenly. Some were copied, commented on, summarized, translated, or known through other writers. Learned readers might encounter Atlantis as part of the inherited world of ancient thought, but the story was often received through moral, philosophical, or cosmological interests rather than through systematic underwater searching. The sea in the story could suggest divine judgment, the instability of earthly greatness, or the limits placed around human pride. A drowned land could be understood as an image of impermanence. A once powerful kingdom could remind readers that no human order, however splendid, stands outside time. In that sense, Atlantis remained useful because it did not need proof to carry warning. It could live as an example. It could be read beside other stories of fallen cities, lost ages, and human overreach. This does not mean every ancient or medieval reader took it only as fiction, nor does it mean they all agreed on its status. The important point is more modest. The dominant energy around Atlantis had not yet become the modern search for coordinates. Its power was still largely reflective. It invited people to consider what happens when wealth, expansion, and memory become separated from wisdom. From the first small groups who learned to pass warnings through speech, to later scholars preserving ancient books by hand, human beings carried the past because they feared forgetting what mattered. Atlantis survived in that stream. It was a story about a vanished place, but also a tool for thinking about living societies. Before it became a popular mystery of maps, lost continents, and hidden ruins, it moved quietly through time as a moral image. A civilization made visible at the moment, its greatness could no longer protect it. In the early modern world, Atlantis slowly changed its clothing. It was no longer only a moral image resting inside ancient philosophy. It began to enter the age of maps, voyages, comparative histories, and new arguments about human origins. European readers were encountering wider oceans, unfamiliar lands, and older texts with fresh intensity. The world seemed larger than inherited learning had allowed, and that enlargement changed how old legends were heard. A story about a powerful island beyond the familiar sea could now feel less like a distant warning and more like a possible clue. People began asking where it might have been, what people might have lived there, and whether it could explain similarities they thought they saw between cultures separated by oceans. Many of those proposals were speculative, and some were shaped by assumptions modern scholarship would not accept. But the shift itself matters. Atlantis moved from the realm of moral reflection toward the realm of origins, geography, and the imagined missing bridge between known histories. This was also a time when human beings were trying to place themselves inside a much larger world. Long before maps were drawn on paper, early humans mapped with bodies, paths walked repeatedly, rivers followed, mountains remembered, shorelines recognized by smell, sound, and season. A group knew the world through movement and memory. Early modern mapping transformed that ancient habit into grids, coastlines, printed atlases, and claims of possession. The map gave distance a new authority. If something could be drawn, named, and placed, it seemed more knowable. Atlantis entered that desire. A lost island could become a missing coordinate, a vanished source, or a hidden explanation for ruins, myths, languages, and peoples that scholars did not yet understand with care. The danger was that an old story could be made to answer questions it was never able to answer. When evidence was limited, imagination often filled the gaps. Atlantis was sometimes used to explain the origins of civilizations in ways that reduced real peoples to descendants of a hypothetical lost center. That move is not honest by modern standards, because cultures develop through long local histories, contact, adaptation, migration, environment, and invention. No single vanished island is needed to explain the richness of human civilization. Still, the appeal is easy to understand. A missing source promises order. It gathers scattered mysteries into one beginning. It gives the mind a place from which complexity can seem to flow. From the first human stories around water and fire to the printed books of early modern Europe, people have often searched for beginnings because beginnings make the present feel less uncertain. Atlantis became one of those imagined beginnings. It was used as a key, even when the lock was not real. At the same time, the period did keep alive a genuine question that deserves respect. How do stories travel? How do cultures influence one another? And how much has been lost from the record? These are serious historical questions. They only become unsafe when a beautiful answer is chosen before evidence has earned it. Atlantis, in the early modern imagination, stood between discovery and projection. The expanding world gave people new data, but also new temptations. A shoreline on a map, a ruined monument, a myth of flood, or a word resembling another word could be pulled toward the old island. The legend widened because the known world was widening. Its meaning changed with the age that read it. Once it had asked what makes a city fall. Now it also seemed to ask whether human history had a missing centre somewhere beneath the sea. Yet the calmer answer is not a hidden continent, but a change in human attention. As old philosophy met new maps and the legend became a quiet mirror for an age slowly learning that the world was wider, older, and harder to explain than it had once believed. In the modern age, Atlantis became more than an old philosophical tale or a question of maps. It became an image that could hold many modern anxieties at once. People now live with cities larger than anything Plato could have imagined, with machines that cross oceans in hours, with lights visible from space, with records stored in invisible systems, and with a sense that civilization is both powerful and strangely exposed. In that world, Atlantis feels less like a remote island, and more like a symbol of how easily achievement can become haunted by the fear of collapse. Films, novels, documentaries, popular books, and online images often treat Atlantis as a hidden world waiting to be uncovered, but beneath the spectacle there is a quieter reason the legend keeps returning. It lets people think about loss without looking directly at their own fragile systems. A city under the sea is safer to imagine than a living city that may be vulnerable to war, climate, inequality, exhaustion, or forgetting. The old island becomes a dream of what was lost, and also a warning about what might still be lost. This modern feeling is connected to something much older in the human body. From the first communities that slept near fire, people have needed to believe that the place around them could be understood well enough to survive. The sound outside the shelter, the change in weather, the movement of animals, the rising of water, all had to be watched. Safety was never absolute. It was learned, renewed, and passed on. Modern civilization can make that old vulnerability harder to feel. Walls are higher. Food comes from far away. Water appears through pipes. Memory is stored in books, servers, schools, and museums. Yet the body remains the same vulnerable body, descended from people who had to read danger in darkness. Atlantis speaks to that buried knowledge. It says that a whole world can look complete and still depend on conditions it does not fully command. That is why the legend fits so easily into modern nostalgia. Many people imagine Atlantis as wiser, cleaner, more advanced, or more harmonious than the present, even though Plato's own story does not simply praise it. This imagined Atlantis becomes a lost golden age, a place where knowledge was whole before history became broken. Such longing is understandable, but it can also mislead. The real past was not a perfect refuge. Ancient societies had labour, conflict, disease, hierarchy, fear, and uncertainty. Turning Atlantis into a flawless lost world can become a way of avoiding the harder lesson of the legend, that civilization is not saved by beauty, wealth, or cleverness alone. It needs limits, memory, and honest attention to consequence. Modern Atlantis also reflects a fear that progress may not be permanent. People see ruins of older empires, abandoned factories, drowned towns, damaged environments, and lost languages, and they know that human order can fade. The legend gives that knowledge a single image. It gathers the fear of environmental change, the fear of political overreach, the fear of technological pride, and the grief of cultural disappearance. It does not need to be a confirmed city to do this work. Its uncertainty is part of its modern power. Because it has not been found, every age can place its own fear inside it. From early humans watching the edge of a river to modern people watching the edge of a warming coast or a crowded city, the same question returns in different clothing. What makes a home feel permanent, and what happens when that feeling breaks? Atlantis remains alive because it is not only about the ancient sea, it is about the human need to imagine a lost world, so that the present world can be seen more clearly. The human mind does not rest easily in empty space. When the record breaks, when a name is missing, when a city leaves no clear voice of its own, the mind begins to search for shape. It asks what stood there, who built it, why it ended, and whether one hidden answer might gather all the fragments together. Atlantis lives inside that habit. It stands where evidence is incomplete and imagination is awake. The legend gives a name to an absence, and because the name is beautiful, old, and surrounded by water, the absence begins to feel almost like a place. This is not a flaw in human nature. It is one of the ways human beings learn to survive. Long before history, before writing, before calendars, our ancestors had to make meaning from partial signs. A footprint did not tell the whole animal. Smoke did not tell the whole fire. A broken branch did not tell the whole danger. Yet a body had to decide. Waiting for perfect knowledge could be as risky as believing too quickly. Human intelligence grew in that narrow space between uncertainty and action. It learned to connect marks, sounds, movements, memories, and fears into possible stories about what had happened and what might happen next. That ancient ability still works inside modern curiosity. When people look at Atlantis, they are not only asking about Plato, they are also using a very old human skill, filling a gap with a pattern. In ordinary life, that skill is useful. It helps us understand faces, language, weather, traces of the past, and the intentions of other people. In history, it must be handled with more care. A gap in the record is not always a door. Sometimes it is only a gap. A missing city is not always hidden. Sometimes it was never there in the form later people imagined. But the desire for completion is strong because unfinished history feels uncomfortable. It leaves the mind without a resting place. Atlantis offers rest of a certain kind. It says that the scattered fears of lost shores, fallen cities, floods, volcanic islands, and moral decline may belong to one great image. It makes the unknown feel organized. The danger is that organization can arrive before evidence. A powerful story can make unrelated traces seem connected simply because the mind wants them to be. This is why careful history slows down where imagination speeds up. It asks whether the pattern is supported outside the story, whether other explanations are more likely, whether the evidence belongs to its own setting, and whether the conclusion has been earned. From the first humans reading marks in mud to modern scholars reading damaged texts and buried layers, the same tension remains. We need patterns, but we also need discipline. Without patterns, the world becomes noise. Without discipline, noise becomes false certainty. Atlantis sits between these two needs. It is powerful because it gives form to absence. It is dangerous when that form is mistaken for proof. The empty spaces in ancient history are not failures to be covered quickly. They are reminders that most human lives left little behind. Countless voices passed without writing. Many settlements left only faint material traces. Many languages vanished without a dictionary. Many memories were carried for a while, then thinned, shifted, or stopped. To face that honestly is not less moving than inventing a hidden empire. It may be more moving. Atlantis teaches us how deeply we want the past to answer back. But the real past often answers in fragments, and the patient mind must learn to hear even the silence. In that silence, Atlantis becomes a lesson in human attention. It shows how the brain reaches for cause, how culture gives the cause a story, and how truth asks the story to wait until the traces can bear its weight. A city beneath the sea is one of the strongest images human memory can make, because it joins two kinds of depth at once. There is the physical depth of water, dark and difficult to enter, and there is the inner depth of forgotten time. When people imagine Atlantis below the surface, they are not only imagining buildings covered by waves, they are imagining memory itself covered over, still present, but unreachable. That is why the image has such quiet force. A ruin on land can be walked around, measured, photographed, and placed into the ordinary world. A ruin under the sea feels removed from ordinary time. It seems to belong to silence, pressure, distance, and a past that cannot be touched without crossing a boundary. The mind responds to that boundary. It begins to feel that the sea is not only hiding stone, but holding back an answer. This feeling reaches far into the human beginning. Early people did not think about memory as a library or an archive. Memory lived in places: the bend of a river, the mouth of a cave, the shape of a hill, the tree line before winter, the shore where a group waited for food or feared a storm. When a place disappeared, changed, or became dangerous, memory had to carry what the eye could no longer trust. A drowned place would be especially powerful because it did not vanish into empty air. It remained there, but changed into another world. The shoreline might still point toward it. The elders might still remember it. The water might cover it each day, turning loss into something visible and invisible at the same time. Atlantis works through that same feeling. The legend gives the mind a submerged container for everything history cannot fully recover. Lost languages, broken records, collapsed societies, forgotten names, and unexcavated lives all gather easily around the image of a city below water. It becomes a metaphor for the past itself. Most of human history is not brightly preserved. It lies in fragments, in stone tools, bones, ash, pottery, marks on walls, buried seeds, damaged texts, and patterns that scholars read with care. Host worlds of speech, affection, fear, work, and memory have left little or nothing. To think honestly about the past is to accept that much of it is submerged, even when no ocean is involved. Atlantis makes that condition visible. It tells the eye what the mind already knows, that something can have mattered deeply and still be beyond reach. This is why the legend can feel intimate even to people who do not believe in it as a confirmed place. Everyone carries some version of buried memory. Families forget names, communities lose stories, languages fade, cities rebuild over older streets, graves become unmarked, childhood places change until they no longer match the remembered shape. The idea of Atlantis touches this ordinary human experience and enlarges it to the scale of civilization. From the first humans who carried memories of vanished camps to modern people looking at old coastlines, the pain is similar in its structure. A world was once present, and now it can only be approached through traces. The sea adds tenderness and distance to that thought. It covers without completely destroying. It hides, but it also preserves the imagination of what might still remain. That is why a submerged city can become more powerful than a city simply ruined on land. It does not let the mind finish the act of mourning. It keeps the lost world suspended. Atlantis survives there, in the space between evidence and longing, where the past seems close enough to feel, but too deep to hold. Atlantis remains compelling because it lives at the perfect distance from certainty. It is far enough away that the mind can dream, yet close enough to touch fears that are not imaginary. If it were fully proven, with streets measured, dates agreed upon, inscriptions read, and ordinary objects placed in museum cases, some of its mist would lift. It would become one ancient place among many, still important, but less able to hold every age's longing. If it were obviously meaningless, with no ancient source, no moral shape, and no connection to real human experiences of water, power, and loss, it would fade like a tale with no roots. Atlantis survives between those two conditions. It is neither confirmed history nor empty fantasy. It is an old story with enough detail to invite searching, enough uncertainty to invite projection, and enough human truth to remain emotionally near. That nearness matters. People do not return to Atlantis only because they want treasure or hidden technology. They return because they know, quietly, that stable worlds can fail, a home can be lost, a coastline can change, a language can disappear. A powerful society can become unable to understand its own danger. Long before cities, before philosophy, before the first written accounts of kings or floods, early humans already lived inside that uncertainty. They moved through landscapes that could feed them or threaten them. They learned that shelter was temporary, memory was protective, and no place was safe simply because it had been safe before. Atlantis carries that older knowledge inside a later classical shape. Its distance allows imagination to soften the fear, while its closeness keeps the fear recognizable. The island is not placed in an ordinary neighborhood or in a recent century. It is set beyond the familiar, behind layers of telling, beyond the reach of direct checking. That distance gives the listener room to breathe. The mind can wander among rings of land and sea, harbors, temples, laws, ships, and vanished shores without being trapped by immediate proof. Yet the feelings beneath the image are not distant at all. They are close to the body. Fear of drowning, fear of being forgotten, fear of trusting walls that cannot hold, fear of a community becoming too proud to listen. These are not exotic fears. They belong to human life across time. The ancient sea simply gives them a quiet surface. This is why Atlantis can be used carelessly, but also why it should not be dismissed too quickly. Its danger lies in the temptation to turn longing into evidence. Its value lies in the way it reveals what human beings keep longing for. People want the lost city to exist because a real Atlantis would make absence less painful. It would say that the missing world is not gone entirely, only hidden. It would promise that time can be reversed by discovery, that the sea may give back what it took, that forgotten brilliance can still be recovered whole. But real history is rarely so generous. The past usually returns in fragments, and many losses remain losses. From the first generation that tried to remember a vanished camp, to modern people studying ruins and old texts, the human task has been to live with incomplete inheritance. Atlantis turns that incompleteness into a landscape. It lets us imagine a world that is lost but still named, unreachable but still present in thought. That is the source of its strange peace. It is far enough to protect us from direct grief, and near enough to remind us that grief belongs to civilization itself. The legend keeps breathing because it allows people to stand at the edge of the known world and feel, without panic, that every human achievement rests between memory and disappearance. In that quiet balance, the island becomes less a destination than a mirror held over deep water and human desire. Not every legend is a record of an event, but many legends preserve the shape of a real human concern. Atlantis is best approached in that careful space. If we treat it only as a failed archaeological claim, we miss the reason it has lasted. If we treat it as confirmed history, we give it a certainty the evidence has not earned. Between those mistakes, the story can still speak. It tells us that people have long feared the moment when a society becomes too confident to notice its own dependence. The island may not be confirmed beneath the sea, but the fear inside the island is not imaginary. Human beings know that order can break. They know that land can change, that memory can fade, that power can become restless, and that a community can lose the habits that once kept it alive. Plato gave this fear a classical form, but the roots of the fear reach much deeper than Plato. From the earliest human beginnings, survival depended on remembering limits. A group could not live by desire alone. It had to learn when to move, when to stay, when to share, when to listen, when to fear water, when to trust a path, and when to leave a place before danger became final. The first human societies were not simple because they lacked cities. They were complex in the way living bodies are complex, held together by need, attention, and memory. A warning had value because it could protect the next generation. A story had value because it could carry a warning farther than one lifetime. Atlantis belongs to that old function of story, even though it appears in a highly developed philosophical text. It is a warning shaped as a lost civilization. Its usefulness does not depend on proving that every canal, king, wall, and date in Plato's account was literal. Its usefulness lies in how it gathers real anxieties into one image. A myth can be untrue as a map and still true as a sign of what people feared. Flood stories do not all need one flood to show that water mattered to human memory. Tales of fallen kings do not all need one king to show that power troubled the human mind. Atlantis does not need to be a confirmed empire to show that civilization has always carried a fear of becoming blind to itself. This is not a weak conclusion. It may be the strongest honest conclusion available. It protects both truth and meaning. The ancient Mediterranean did know maritime power, earthquakes, volcanic events, fragile trade, political conflict, and cities that rose and fell. Human history is full of societies that changed beyond recognition, not always from one cause, and not always in a single dramatic moment. Atlantis compresses that complexity into a calm but unforgettable shape. It does what stories often do. It gives one body to many pressures. When we understand this, we no longer have to choose between wonder and responsibility. We can let the legend remain a legend, while still asking what human reality made it durable. The answer is not a secret machine or a hidden continent. It is the ordinary but profound fact that every civilization is built by vulnerable bodies in changing environments. Every archive can burn. Every harbour can fail. Every language depends on speakers who may not survive. Every law depends on people willing to remember why it matters. From the first shelters to the largest cities, human beings have lived by building patterns against uncertainty. Atlantis endures because it reminds us that those patterns are precious, but never absolute. It is not merely a story about something that vanished. It is a story about why disappearance has always frightened a species that survives by remembering. Atlantis becomes most useful when it is read as a warning about limits. In Plato's account, the lost island is not poor, weak, or helpless. It is rich, organized, confident, and able to reach beyond itself. That is what makes the warning gentle but severe. The danger is not only failure from outside, the danger is success that loses its measure. A society can gather resources, build harbours, train armies, store wealth, and command movement across the sea, while slowly forgetting that every form of power still rests on conditions it did not create. Soil must remain fertile. Water must remain usable. Trust must remain strong enough for people to cooperate. Leaders must remember that authority is not the same as wisdom. Generations must inherit more than buildings. They must inherit the reasons those buildings were worth making. Atlantis places all of this inside one image of abundance approaching ruin. It asks the listener to notice that the greatest weakness of a powerful society may be the belief that power itself has solved the problem of vulnerability. From the beginning of human life, this was never true. Early humans survived not because they dominated the world completely, but because they learned to live within signs and limits. They watched weather, animal movement, hunger, water, fire, injury, and the moods of other people. A group that ignored limits did not become free from them. It simply met them later, with less preparation. Civilization enlarges the same old lesson. A city can store food against hunger, but it cannot abolish dependence on land. A fleet can cross water, but it cannot command the sea to remain calm. A law can organize people, but it cannot protect a society if desire, fear, and pride hollow out the habits that make law meaningful. Atlantis is memorable because it turns this quiet structure into a place. Its wealth is not only decoration, its wealth is the test. Its reach is not only grandeur, its reach is the pressure that reveals whether power still knows restraint. Human history gives many real examples of societies strained by resource use, political ambition, war, environmental change, and inner division, though each case has its own evidence and should not be forced into one simple pattern. Plato's story compresses that wider human concern into a single moral landscape. A great island stands, expands, and then disappears. The listener is left not with a technical explanation, but with a feeling of proportion. No society is so large that it can stop needing balance. No community is so clever that it can live without memory. No empire is so wealthy that it can spend trust carelessly and remain whole. Pride becomes dangerous when it makes dependence invisible. This is why Atlantis still speaks to the present without needing to be treated as a literal map. Modern societies also live by systems so wide that many people no longer feel the ground beneath them. Food travels through long chains. Energy moves through hidden networks. Water arrives through pipes. Knowledge is stored far from the body. Comfort can make the old human limits seem distant, but they have not vanished. They have only become harder to see. The earliest people felt limits through cold, hunger, darkness, thirst, and distance. Later civilizations feel them through failing institutions, exhausted landscapes, broken supply routes, and memories that no longer teach caution clearly enough. Atlantis gathers these dangers into a calm, symbolic form. It reminds us that power without restraint can become heavy, resources without gratitude can be treated as endless, and pride can make a society deaf to the very warnings meant to preserve it. The real value of the legend is not that it gives a lost city back to us, but that it asks what any city must remember before loss begins to look inevitable. The value of Atlantis does not depend on finding one point on a map. If the legend were only a question of location, then its meaning would shrink to a single coordinate, a single excavation, a single announcement that the search was over. But the story has lasted because it asks questions that are wider than geography. What makes a society believe it is safe? What does wealth do to memory? How does power change the way people listen to warning signs? Why do human beings keep imagining a place that was brilliant, distant, and lost? These questions remain alive even without a confirmed ruin. They reach into the history of cities, but also into the beginning of human life, when survival depended on remembering where danger had appeared and where trust had failed. Before people drew maps, they still carried mental landscapes. They knew water sources, paths, shelters, seasons, and the stories attached to them. A place mattered because bodies had lived there, suffered there, learned there, and passed that knowledge forward. Atlantis enlarges that ancient bond between place and meaning. It gives us a place that may not be recoverable, then asks why unrecoverable places still matter so deeply to the mind. A map can show distance, but it cannot show why loss hurts. An excavation can reveal objects, but it cannot alone explain why later generations long for vanished worlds. Atlantis stands where these two forms of knowing meet. On one side is the careful need for evidence. On the other is the human need to understand impermanence. The legend becomes valuable when it teaches us not to confuse those needs. Evidence asks for restraint. Meaning asks for attention. A good listener can hold both. Plato's story does not have to be accepted as a literal report in order to make us think about real human problems. It invites reflection on the limits of growth, the danger of pride, the dependence of every city on land and water, and the weakness of memory when comfort becomes too strong. These questions are more useful than a forced answer. They do not flatter the listener with secret knowledge. They invite the listener to become more careful with knowledge itself. That may be the deepest educational gift of Atlantis. It teaches that the past is not an empty space waiting for fantasy, and not a dead space closed to wonder. It is a living field of traces, stories, silences, and responsibilities. From the earliest human groups to the ancient Mediterranean and onward into modern cities, People have always lived between what they can prove and what they must still wonder about. The danger comes when wonder tries to replace proof, or when proof is demanded to do all the work of meaning. Atlantis asks us to slow down before that mistake. It asks us to look at why a lost island feels necessary to the imagination. Perhaps people return to it because they fear that their own world could become unreadable to the future. Perhaps they sense that civilization is not only made of stone and law, but of habits that can fade quietly before anything visibly falls. Perhaps they want the sea to keep a memory for them, because human memory feels too fragile on its own. None of these thoughts requires us to invent evidence. They require only patience. That patience is old, almost bodily, like waiting beside tracks in dust until the ground offers another sign. The real story of Atlantis may therefore be less about where the island was than about what the legend does inside human history. It gathers the fear of collapse, the hope of recovery, the discipline of doubt, and the longing for a lost beginning. Its map is not the ocean alone. Its map is the human need to ask why greatness disappears and what kind of wisdom might be learned before disappearance begins. The most widely accepted beginning of Atlantis is not a drowned city, but a passage in Plato's dialogues. That is the anchor that keeps the story honest. Before modern searches, before maps covered the oceans with proposed locations, before volcanic islands and submerged ridges were pulled into the discussion, Atlantis was a written example inside a Greek philosophical world. Plato placed it in Timaeus and Critias, where the tale arrives through remembered voices and is used to contrast forms of civilization. This beginning may feel less dramatic than a ruin rising from the sea, but it is stronger because it rests on what can actually be shown. The earliest secure evidence for Atlantis is textual. It belongs to Plato's language, Plato's concerns, and the political imagination of a Greek thinker asking how societies become just, how they become corrupt, and why power can turn against the order that created it. To return to that beginning is not to empty the legend of wonder. It is to remove the false weight that later centuries placed upon it. The story can breathe more clearly when it is not forced to pretend it is an excavation report. Plato wrote, after Athens had suffered war, defeat, faction, and moral uncertainty. He knew that a city famous for intelligence and beauty could also be reckless, divided, and vulnerable to its own desires. Atlantis gave him a distant image through which that danger could be contemplated. A great island power, rich and expansive, stands against an older vision of measured civic order. Its loss becomes a way of thinking about the limits of ambition. This was not a random fantasy placed beside philosophy. It was a crafted image inside a larger argument about the soul of a city. Long before any Greek dialogue, human groups had already learned that memory protects life only when it remains tied to limits. The first communities did not survive because they owned permanent ground. They survived because they watched water, weather, hunger, trust, and danger with care. Plato's Atlantis lifts that ancient human lesson into the language of states and empires. The camp becomes a city. The dangerous river becomes an ocean. The failure to listen becomes a civilization brought to silence. When the story is read this way, its real historical value becomes clearer. It tells us less about one confirmed place than about the way Greeks could use older-sounding stories to think about political decline. The chain through Egypt, Solon, Critias, and family memory gives the tale age and authority, but it does not turn it into direct evidence. It shows how ancient writers framed knowledge, how distance could make a story feel weighty, and how respected names could carry moral force. The accepted starting point remains Plato, not a lost archive from Atlantis itself. No inscription from that kingdom has been recovered. No agreed archaeological layer has spoken in its name. No material culture has been securely tied to the island described in the dialogue. That absence does not require contempt. It requires discipline. Many old stories matter even when they are not literal records. They preserve fears, values, comparisons and warnings that belong to real people living in real historical conditions. From early humans carrying danger through oral memory to literate Greeks shaping memory into argument, the human past has always moved through both trace and story. Atlantis stands exactly there. It is a story about loss, born in a text, strengthened by the ancient fear that a powerful society can forget the conditions that keep it alive. Its most trustworthy origin is therefore not under the water, but in the place where philosophy, civic trauma, and human memory meet. It lets a listener keep the legend intact as a human document, while refusing to turn uncertainty into a claim the evidence cannot safely hold, or a mystery into a certainty it has never yet earned. Several real histories may stand behind the emotional world of Atlantis, but none can safely be named as the whole answer. That distinction is where honesty lives. The Eastern Mediterranean did know volcanic islands, earthquakes, waves, shifting trade, political rivalry, and societies whose forms changed over time. Thera did erupt with great force. The Minoan world did flourish across Crete and the Aegean. Coastal communities did depend on water that could feed them, connect them, and threaten them. Bronze Age centers did experience destruction, abandonment, transformation, and silence in the record. All of these realities help explain why a story about a powerful island lost to disaster could feel believable. They give Atlantis a climate of possibility, but possibility is not the same as confirmation. A volcanic eruption can resemble one feature of the legend without explaining the whole legend. A maritime civilization can resemble one mood of the story without becoming the lost kingdom. A flood memory can echo the drowning image without proving the location of a city. The careful mind has to let echoes remain echoes when the evidence does not carry them further. This is not a failure of imagination. It is a way of respecting both the legend and the real past. From the earliest human communities, people learned by connecting signs. A dark cloud, a rising river, a cracked slope, a silence among animals, or a change in wind could matter. Pattern recognition protected vulnerable bodies. Yet survival also required testing patterns against experience. If every shadow became a predator, fear would exhaust the group. If every mark became a path, people could be led into danger. The same ancient balance is needed when we listen to Atlantis. We can notice that Thera, Crete, Bronze Age collapse, flood traditions, and Plato's moral world all stand near the legend. But we cannot compress them into one secret history simply because the shape feels satisfying. The past is often less tidy than a story. It changes unevenly. It leaves fragments. It allows several causes to operate at once. It lets some communities continue while others suffer. It hides the voices of ordinary people while preserving a palace wall, a potsherd, or a line of text. Atlantis, by contrast, gives a clear image of greatness and disappearance. That clarity is beautiful, but it is also why caution is needed. A clear image can make complex history look simpler than it was. The most responsible conclusion is that Atlantis may have drawn strength from a world where real disasters and real collapses were known, but the account we possess remains Plato's crafted story. It may carry influences. It may preserve an atmosphere. It may reflect the fear of island loss, the memory of maritime power, or the moral anxiety of a city worried about ambition. Yet none of these possibilities should be turned into a final claim. To say this calmly is not to remove value from the legend. It gives the legend its proper value. Atlantis becomes a meeting place between evidence and imagination, not a substitute for either one. It teaches that the human past is built from material traces, written voices, environmental pressures, and the stories people create when they try to understand loss. From the first remembered shoreline to the ancient philosophers' dialogue, human beings have always stood between what happened, what was preserved, and what later minds needed the event to mean. Atlantis belongs to that space. It may carry the sound of real seas and real ruins around its edges, but its center remains unproven. The honest listener can still feel its power without pretending that power has become proof. The real story of Atlantis ends not with a discovered city, but with a way of listening. After all the searches, maps, theories, and images of temples beneath blue water, the most honest lesson is simple and calm. A story can be powerful without being proven as a literal place. Atlantis began, as far as secure evidence shows, in Plato's writing. It grew because later people recognized something inside it that did not belong only to Greece. They recognized the fear that wealth can blind, that water can change the edge of home, that memory can turn fragile, and that even a confident society may depend on conditions it has stopped noticing. This is the educational value of the legend. It teaches us how to separate evidence from desire without losing wonder. Evidence asks us to move slowly. Desire asks us to complete the picture. The past often gives us neither a full silence nor a full answer, but fragments resting between the two. Atlantis is one of those fragments, not because the island itself has been confirmed, but because the legend reveals how human beings think about loss. From the earliest people who slept near rivers, watched storms, and remembered dangerous places for their children, survival has depended on carrying warnings forward. A human group could not live only in the present. It had to remember where water rose, where food failed, where trust broke, where a path became unsafe, and where pride had cost too much. Later civilizations gave those old lessons larger shapes. They built archives, temples, laws, harbours, schools, ships, and stories. Yet beneath all that complexity remained the same vulnerable body, needing shelter, food, trust, and a world stable enough to understand. Atlantis speaks to that body. It does not need to be a confirmed empire to remind us that civilization is not permanent by nature. It is maintained by attention. A city lasts because people remember why restraint matters. A culture lasts because one generation teaches the next what cannot be taken for granted. A shoreline remains home only while land, water, labour, and memory stay in balance. When those balances weaken, loss may begin long before anything visibly sinks. This is why the legend should not be used to sell false certainty. A claim that Atlantis has certainly been found may feel exciting for a moment, but it teaches the wrong habit. It teaches the mind to prefer completion over truth. A calmer reading teaches something more useful. It teaches patience with uncertainty. It teaches respect for real ancient societies, such as the Minoans, without forcing them into a name they did not leave behind. It teaches respect for Plato's text, without pretending that a philosophical warning is the same as an archaeological report. It teaches respect for disaster memories, without turning every flood into one universal proof. In that careful space, Atlantis becomes deeper, not smaller. It becomes a mirror in which human beings can see their own longing for lost beginnings, their fear of collapse, and their hope that something meaningful can survive disappearance. Perhaps that is why the legend stayed alive for more than 2,000 years. It gives us a vanished world, but refuses to give us final possession of it. It keeps the mind awake, but not alarmed. It asks us to look at our own world with gentler seriousness. What do we build that future people may not understand? What warnings do we ignore because comfort makes them quiet? What memories should we protect before they become unreachable? The real Atlantis may be less a place under the sea than a lesson held at the edge of human memory, reminding us that truth is not weakened by caution, and wonder is not lost when we refuse to invent what the evidence has not given. It leaves us with one quiet question. What will we choose to remember before another world begins to disappear?